Well, if Christianity is true and God has created individual people, or just people, then there is a way that He has designed us to be, a way that He's designed us to function. The more we align ourselves with that, the more of a flourishing kind of person or kind of thing that we are.
So, why should Christianity matter to someone who's just having fun and living their life? And what encouragement is there for someone who perhaps is drawn to Jesus, but has been hurt by people who say that they follow him? We're going to talk about that and more today. Welcome back to the Finding Something Real podcast, friend. This is your host, Janelle Wood, and you are listening in for season 7, where we talk with different young women from various backgrounds about their faith journeys and allow them the space to ask some tough questions about God and Christianity. And today we're recording an episode for my niece, Noelle. For those of you who have missed Noelle's story, here's a short clip from my first conversation with her that shares a little bit of her current worldview.
I've really been trying to do some deep inner kind of thinking about my own personal beliefs on these things, and not just what the internet's telling me or what I'm hearing about. I want to know like what I actually think. And my kind of thinking on it is like, we just need to love everyone. Like, that is the very bottom line, is that we just need to love and accept everyone, and treat each other well, treat each other with love and respect. Just because, someone is different or like weird to you, doesn't mean that they're bad, and we can still love them. Um, and it upsets me, like, this idea of like hierarchological stuff.
Yeah,
that word. Yeah.
We know what you mean.
Yeah, and just the sense of superiority of certain people, certain groups, and the inequity that a lot of people face, and the kind of apathy that is shown towards it, and like not a whole lot of effort gets put in, I feel like, to kind of help the people. Yeah. So yeah, just love and acceptance and happiness and joy. That'll bring us together. I don't see why we need to hate.
Noelle, you're back today. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Yeah. Done with my classes for this quarter. So that's great. We're just chilling now till the next one. So
Yeah.
It's a beautiful day in Bellingham. I'm gonna go outside right after this. So it's a good day.
Yeah, I was talking to a
Yeah.
friend from Bellingham the other day, and she said it was like spring had arrived in Bellingham up there.
Just like a switch flipped, and it's just gorgeous now.
Yeah.
I love it.
So are you going to go hiking or like walking around? There's a really nice trail around one of the lakes over there. Is it Lake Whatcom, or I don't even know.
Oh, I don't know. I live really close to the Seaholm Hill Arboretum.
Okay.
And it reminds me a lot of Lord Hill in Snohomish. So I like to walk around there.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I know it's really beautiful up there, and I'm
Mhm.
excited for this conversation today. Noelle, as you know, a few of our episodes have started airing, and just curious, have you heard from any of your friends who share your worldview about these episodes? Have they been like, "Whoa, Noelle, what are you doing? What are you doing on that Christian podcast over there?"
Um, I've only received support from my friends because my friends are awesome and I love them.
Yeah.
I think everyone's like, what's this about? Like, what are you doing? But I've received lots of love and support, and I'm very thankful for that. Yeah.
Shout out to good friends, huh?
Yes.
That's
Love
awesome.
them.
Well, I'm so glad you keep coming back for these conversations because I love doing this podcasting journey with you. And today we have another special guest. Our guest today is Dr. John Marriott. He is a faculty affiliate of the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University's Institute for Quantitative Social Science. He is the former research and program coordinator for the Biola University Center for Christian Thought and teaches part-time in the Department of Philosophy at Talbot School of Theology. A former pastor, he holds a PhD degree from the Cook School of Intercultural Studies. His dissertation focused on deconversion from Christianity to atheism. He is the author of 5 books on deconversion. His 6th book, The Good Book, Restoring Your Faith in the Bible by Questioning Everything You Assume About It, is due for release later this year. Dr. John Marriott, welcome to the Finding Something Real podcast.
Thank you. Good to be with both of you today. Thanks for the invitation.
It's good to be with you too. Was all of that bio currently correct? Was that up to date?
Yeah,
Sometimes
that was right.
I'll read a bio. Yeah.
Yeah. The book actually might be coming out next year, but that's just got pushed back on the calendar. But otherwise, everything is correct. Yes.
Wow. So pretty impressive stuff there. You're a Christian, obviously. How did you come to faith? And did you ever go through your own time of deconversion or deconstruction?
It's hard to know when I came to faith because I grew up in a home that was a Christian home, and we went to church. My dad came from had no faith background. He became a Christian when he met my mother, who came from a very conservative background. And our home was kind of a mix of both of those. My mother was deeply concerned that I be a Christian and took us to church. My dad also went along. And I remember when I was young, maybe, I don't know, it's hard to know, but like 5 or 6, and my mother telling me this is what I needed to do. And so I prayed a prayer. I remember where it was. It was in our living room. And I think that I had a pretty sensitive God consciousness growing up throughout my younger years. But when I was 14, I went to a Bible camp in Northern Ontario in Canada, where I'm from. And it was there that I recognized I really needed to make this my own faith, make a decision myself, not just because my mother told me to do so. And I made some kind of a rededication to Jesus. And I'm not sure at what point I really became a born again or a true follower, but somewhere between one of those times, I think, is when I became a follower of Jesus and have tried to live my life for him in varying degrees of proximity to him over the years. Your second question was, have I ever gone through this period of deconstruction? And I suppose it depends on what you mean by the term. Right? It gets used by lots of different people, lots of different ways. For some people, deconstruction means I found something really problematic. I don't think Christianity is true. And now I'm going to point out all of the other problematic things that I find in Christianity. I've kind of already left, but I'm going to deconstruct it and show why I think it's harmful or untrue. Some other people will say I'm deconstructing in a sense where I don't know if it's true. I've been handed this faith, but I'm not sure if Jesus really is the way. And I'm going to rethink all of that and ask myself the question whether or not I should be involved with this. And then the third way that people use the term, it seems, at least to me, is they say, I think that Jesus is the way, but I don't know what the way of Jesus is supposed to look like anymore, because I'm getting the sense that what I've been handed isn't really just the pure, unadulterated, version of Christianity that Jesus had in mind. I think that there's been a lot of things that have been accrued and cultural things and traditional things that maybe really aren't Jesus-y kind of things. I want to pull all that apart and evaluate it and put it back together in a way that I think maybe fits the Bible better. I think I went through it in a period of deconstruction, if you would like to call it that, in phase 2 and phase 3. I was about in my early 20s, maybe, and I had made a commitment to Jesus at 14. And then I realized that I had not really thought much about whether it was true, right? So I grew up in it. I assumed it was true. Then I made a commitment to it at 14. But then at 20, I looked back and said, but do I think this is really true? I've never even asked that question. and really rethought and looked into and asked questions. And then I'm always going through this process of asking myself now, what parts of Christianity that I think are are good and true, that I can find support for in the Bible, and what are some of the things that I hold to that maybe aren't representative of Jesus. They're maybe more representative of kind of an American evangelicalized version of Christianity in the early part of the 21st century. So yes, in a short answer to this question, yes, I've gone through that, and those were the ways that I did.
Well, that's interesting because all of your work that I can see has been focused around this topic of deconversion or deconstruction. How did you become so passionate about this particular topic? Because it's not just one book. I think I listed off 6, and it's something that you're well known for. How did that happen?
I think it's really two things. One, I think it was just my own insecurity, right? I had lots of questions. I had, so I think there's a bit of I think there's a skeptic in me, but I think the skeptic comes out of an insecurity, just assuming maybe I'm wrong or maybe I've misunderstood it, or what's the chances that what I believe is right compared to all the other people out there who have different opinions. And so that always drove me to asking questions, which often caused me to have lots of doubts and really investigating and thinking. That's part of it. The other part of it was someone who was a hero of mine, both spiritually and athletically, was someone who impacted my life, and I felt as though God had providentially arranged the events of the universe so that I could meet this person. Ended up leaving the faith. The short story of the long story is, when I was in college, I was on a Division I track and field team on the East Coast. My event was a triple jump, so they scholarship you to do that. There's an unspoken agreement that you will perform because they're paying you to go to the school for them. And I was performing poorly, and I was very discouraged and very down, just really disheartened. And all at the same time, outside of my world, there was a guy named Jonathan Edwards who was the world record holder in the triple jump within those years I was at college, and he was a Christian who was more known for his faith than he was his athletic ability, and his athletic ability was just off the charts. He broke the world record 3 times in 1 year. He jumped over 60 feet, a quarter of an inch, and he was the British Athlete of the Year. He was the International Athletic Association Athlete of the Year. And he had previously, though, missed an Olympics and a World Championships because of his Christian convictions that he didn't want to compete on a Sunday. He was known more for his character than he was his athletic accomplishments. And when I was at Florida State University in spring break for a meet, Jonathan Edwards was there in the weight room. Now, here he was from Great Britain, and here I was from a school up on the East Coast, and we happened to be at the same place at the same time at the most discouraging point in my career. I wanted to quit. I even had just a week before said, I think I'm gonna be done. And here he is in the weight room. So I went over, talked with him. We had this great conversation. He invited me out for lunch. We picked his wife up from a Bible study. He told me how he is going to go to seminary when he is done competing. He came and watched me jump. I went and watched him in Edmonton at the World Championships a few years later. I have these great photographs of him. And then when he retired, he became the host of the BBC's television show Songs of Praise. It's the longest running TV show in the UK, and it's a show for shut-ins who can't make it out to church. So he was the face of Christianity for so many people in Great Britain. And in 2007, I looked him up and I thought, I wonder what he's doing these days. And I came across a headline and it said, Edwards takes leap out of faith. Gold medalist says he's never been more happy. And I couldn't believe what I was reading. And I read that article and I reread that article, and I had no categories to process it. How could this guy who was so deeply committed to Jesus, how could he just decide it wasn't true anymore? And then I realized, after looking into it a little bit more, that he's just one famous Christian of tens of thousands of people who once identified as a Christian who have done the exact same thing. And I thought, why is this happening, and what is causing people, because I already have my own skepticism, my own doubts, what's causing people to walk away? And that is what spurred me on to do my doctoral research. I interviewed lots of people. I read hundreds of narratives of people who said that they left, and tried to come up with something that provided some explanation or account for why people who once identified as Christians, and some very committed Christians, no longer do.
Hmm. I have follow-up questions for that, but Noelle, before I ask away, what are your thoughts?
I just first would like to say that that's very cool that you're like so interested in studying this kind of like confusing situation about people who were super devoted and then all of a sudden we're just like, wait, mm-mm. And just in general, like religion and Christianity, there's so much with it, so much to study that of course I feel like you could write 20 dissertations just on any of it. And I find that very admirable. I think it's very cool to really, really look into that. Um, yeah, not really a question, just a awesome. Also
Thank you.
cool that you did track. That's very cool. I did track in high school, but I was a
Ah,
distance runner.
okay.
Yeah.
I have a lot of respect for distance runners.
Thank you. Yeah, it
Yes,
it was difficult.
yes, yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Hmm.
So, John, first of all, I know you have a website. I want to make sure that we mention where that is so that people can find you after this conversation. Where can people find you when they want to know more about what we're about to talk about?
My website is just my name, John Marriott. So Marriott, like the hotel, two R's, two T's, .org. So .org. And on the website, you can find some resources for people who are in the process of really wrestling and thinking through their faith. You can find resources for people who are helping others in the midst of that wrestling match. And then there's some encouraging stories of people who once identified as a follower of Jesus, left the faith, and then have returned. And then there's a free book and some other info there as well, if anyone's interested.
Hmm. So, what are some of the themes that you found in researching all of this? Why? I mean, that's a big question. Like Noelle just said, there could be probably 20 books, maybe more about this. But why do people, especially people who are publicly known for their faith, why are they publicly leaving it? What did you find?
When you ask people why they left the faith, they all have the same answer, but they all just get there from a different avenue. And that answer is because they came to the conclusion that it was no longer true.
Hmm.
No one ever says, I left the faith because I want to sin more. No one ever says, I left the faith because church was boring, or I left the faith because, it cramped my lifestyle. And unfortunately, Christians are generally quick to say that about people who have left the faith. Or maybe you just never sincerely really believed ever to begin with. Like those are some of the most offensive things that people will hear. But if you listen long enough, you'll find that people will say, I left because it wasn't true. For some people, it seems as though reason plays a significant role. They'll say, I decided to investigate. I came to the conclusion that there are no good arguments for the existence of God, or there's not enough evidence for the existence of God, or all of the arguments in favor of Jesus, his resurrection, the reliability of the Bible, all of those fail. And therefore, I don't think that Christianity is true. Other people will come at it from a different perspective. They'll say perhaps something along the lines of, hey, if Christianity produces these kinds of people, and I have a general understanding of what it means to be a good person, and if these people are so far away from my general understanding of what it means to be a good person, and this is what Christianity produces, then how can Christianity be true? Because I have been so hurt. I have been so wounded, maybe betrayed, manipulated by people who identified as followers of Jesus. And if that's what following Jesus produces, then it can't be true, because I have a deep down, unshakable belief that if you're following the truth, it will make you a good person. And these people were following Jesus, they said, and it made them a really bad person, which gives me good reason to think that Christianity isn't true. So there's an emotional reason, or an experiential reason, maybe is another way of saying it. There's also a value reason. And I think that this one is perhaps maybe more becoming more popular, or is the underwriting for a lot of people who are leaving the faith. And that would be this, is that I hold to values that are deeply important to me. And I find that the Bible does not support those values, or in some ways, the Bible may even speak out against those values. Often, when it comes to identity, sexual ethics, those kinds of issues, Gen Z is perhaps the most tolerant, accepting, welcoming group of people. And I think there are reasons for that. Some of them very good, maybe some of them not so good. So when the Bible speaks out and says that certain practices or behaviors or ways of identifying are outside of biblical morality, I think that for some people, they'll say, but if that's the case, then I don't think that the Bible's true, and I don't think Christianity is true, because it really strikes me as maybe being intolerant or bigoted. And I have a deep down conviction that the truth is loving and kind and gracious and accepting. And so for some people, it's a deep set of values that are incompatible with what they see in the Bible. And for other people, they feel betrayed maybe by God, that they have lived for God, they have tried to follow God, they've tried to serve God, and then when the chips were down and they really needed God to come through, he didn't come through in the way that they expected him to come through or assumed that he would. And so they feel as though God just hasn't let them down. He's really betrayed them. He was given what he was asked: worship, honor, obedience, and they expected in return something from him when they deeply needed it, and it didn't come. And therefore, that leads some people to say, I don't think that it's true. Everybody gets to the I don't think it's true location, but they all come at it from different ways. So the catalyst can be intellectual, emotional, experiential, or value, sort of a value that doesn't line up. And that's kind of it in a nutshell.
Does that ring true for you, Noelle? I know you once were a church girl and now you're not. I'd love for you to speak to that.
The answer to that is yes. I really like that kind of like breakdown, especially with like my experience on this podcast. It's kind of been like where I've done most of my talking about like religion and maybe reasons for why people or myself don't follow it. And yeah, I identify with pretty much all of those reasons to some extent. And I think it's very complex. And yeah, lots of people, I think, experience that like I do.
Thank you for being open and sharing all that. So, John, you've done all this research. Obviously, you have some empathy for people who have experienced all of this. But you've stuck with Jesus. Why? And then I'd love to get into some of the questions about why, should Christianity matter for someone who's having fun just having deconstructed or left the church? But first, why are you still a Christian? What happened with you?
I think the same reason, but maybe the mirror opposite for why people leave. They found that it wasn't true. I think I am. I think that it is true. Although I don't think that you have to be certain that it's true. I don't even think you have to be confident that it's true. I think that you can think that it's more likely true than false and still follow Jesus in a way that is faithful to what he calls us to. Sometimes I think that, and I hear this from people who will say, well, being a believer means that you believe, and the stronger and the more confident and the more certain you are, that's really the ideal of what it means to be a real believer, because it's kind of on this scale of, I'm a weak believer or I'm a really strong believer. But I think that the Bible, what it calls us to is having enough reasons for a hope worth acting on. And I think that if a person thinks that the evidence for, or the reasons for Christianity being true are more likely true than false, then I think that they can act on that and live out their place in the story according to the script. And that's what I think biblical faith really is. It's not being certain. It's nice if you are certain. It would be great to have really high confidence. But I think being a follower of Jesus comes down to thinking that it's true. And by true, I mean it's more likely true than false. And even though my confidence can go up and my confidence can lag, as long as I have enough to keep going, then to put one foot in front of the other and follow Jesus as a disciple of his, that's what I think he's calling us to, which means that someone could be a person of great faith, even though they have, not a lot of overwhelming confidence in the truth claims. But as long as they have enough, and of course that's going to be different for everyone. So I think I've come to the place where I have enough, where I'm not absolutely certain that Christianity is true. I have questions. I have some skepticism sometimes. I do have some doubts, but I have enough that I can make a conscious choice to act on this hope that I have. Now, why do I have that? That's a whole, that's a complex question, right? Because sometimes when I talk to people who say, "Oh, I've left the faith," and then they give me all the reasons why, and it's all intellectual, I think that perhaps there's more going on there than they realize, because there's always more going on than I realize in why I am a Christian. I think that when you look at an iceberg, you see the top of the iceberg that sticks out of the water. And I think that those are usually the reasons that people give, mostly those intellectual reasons. So why am I a Christian? I'll give you all these reasons why. I think there's good evidence for the resurrection. I think there's good evidence for the Bible's reliability, etc. But I think underneath the part of the iceberg that's under the water probably is playing more of a role than the part that's above the water. And I think the same thing is true when people leave the faith, that there's more going on under the water than the stated reasons above. For me, some of those reasons that I kind of now look back on and say, why was I a Christian? If you had asked 20 years ago, I would have told you it's all the rational reasons why. But now I look at it and I think, well, because the people who really made an impact on me at the right age for Jesus were really wonderful examples of what it means to follow him in grace and in truth, and who loved me really well. And there are some social reasons why I'm a Christian, right? I wanted to be like those people because they were wonderful people. And Peter says that that's what drew him to Jesus. In 2 Peter, he says, that it was his glory and virtue, his person, that drew the disciples to him. So I think that that's a big part of it. I think there's a big part of it that says that, I can't allow my desires to override what I think is true, but I do think that there's a part of me that, of course, wants it to be true, in the same way that I think that sometimes when people leave the faith, there's a part of them that doesn't want it to be true. Not necessarily everyone all the time, but there's this large part of us, the under the surface, off the radar, under the hood, that kind of that plays a significant role. And what I would encourage people who are thinking about leaving the faith is to really ask themselves why that is the case. Is it something that's not necessarily a rational reason, and is the something else driving the train, and the caboose is reasons that are justifying where the train is going? Or is it a genuine seeking for truth that's driving the train, and other things kind of are following? So for me, I'm always trying to make it about the truth question. And I think that I've uncovered enough evidence that I think it's more likely true than false. I actually think that it's more than just that. I'm persuaded that it's true, um, and so I think that that's, I guess that's how I would answer the question.
Hmm. That's interesting. I was thinking as you were talking about people like, under Nero, and what the 60 ADs or whatever, who are being burned on the torches in his garden, right? Do you feel like people like that who are like, okay, I'm all in no matter what the cost? Um, and not to say that you're not, but do you think that there's a higher degree of certainty that you have to have in order to walk like that? Or is it more likely than not? Because I know for me personally, in my own faith journey, I feel like, well, I need to be pretty locked in with the Lord in order to give up my own desires, even little ones, but I can't even imagine giving up everything, um, as I see some of my brothers and sisters have done throughout the ages. Do you want to speak to that?
I think there's certainly something to that. I do think it's a lot easier to be all in, as you said, if you don't have any questions, if you don't have any doubts. But sometimes I think people, we're all made differently. I had a grandmother who had no doubts about anything when it came to her faith. Very simple, you know. But I do suspect that the more you get exposed to the world, whether that's by getting out and traveling and meeting other people who are different from you, or by encountering ideas on the internet, or even leaving home, maybe going to college, uh, it's almost impossible, I think, to be in the 21st century and be exposed to many of those things, and be maybe of a certain personality type, and not start to wonder and not start to have questions. I think that doubting and having questions is completely normal. I am skeptical of people who say they never have any doubts whatsoever, because I wonder, but have you really thought about it? Like, there's a lot of people who don't know Jesus, who, what's happening to them after they die, and what about all the people in China who never heard the gospel for thousands of years? Like, these are really hard questions, and I think that people who are maybe a little bit more reflective, or curious, maybe skeptical by bent, have those. And so to be all in and to be somebody who's on a spigot in Nero's garden, um, probably is slightly easier if you don't have those doubts. But I don't think that you necessarily have to be completely locked in and have objective certainty to be able to walk that road, because I do think that there's the grace of God that comes in, and I do think that there is an ability that He provides. And so I think it would be hard if you were just over 50% in thinking that it's true to be willing to suffer. But I'm not sure you have to be at, 100% certainty. I do think, though, the closer you get to that, probably there's a bit of it's easier mentally, perhaps, to do that, though.
Hmm. It's interesting. I was also thinking as you were talking about Mother Teresa, who talked about how she felt she lost her faith, but she kept on going.
That's right.
Noelle, did you ever read about that? Like how she was like wrestling with Jesus all these years she was in ministry. Did you know about that?
No,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's cool.
She called him the absent one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And yet she continued to follow after him, even though she couldn't see him emotionally, I guess.
Yeah, and it's not as though it was a completely blind faith for her. It wasn't just a leap of faith without any reasons whatsoever, right? There were reasons that she had. There's historical reasons that she had. There's her previous experience that she could look back to. There's times in the Bible where there are people who say, "Where are you, God?" And she could look at those and say, "Oh, yeah, this is not completely abnormal." Um, but I think that's a great example of someone who had enough reasons for a hope worth acting on, but there were times that it was very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you're a Christian, you know the Great Commission. Noelle and I had talked earlier in our first conversation about why do Christians feel like they have to share the good news with everybody else. We talked a little bit about that. I think we've talked about it in some subsequent conversations. But clearly, as a believer, I'm sure you share that sentiment that you want to share your faith with others. So, what encouragement would you give to somebody who maybe has deconstructed their faith, or someone like Noelle who's like, I'm cool as I am. This is chill. I'm good. Um, what's so compelling about Jesus, who may, you know, ask for you to give up a lot? Why Jesus? What's the big deal?
Yeah, well, so I think I'm probably tempted to say something cliche like, "Well, because he's worth it," or something along those lines that sounds kind of pious, but um, maybe just betrays the fact that there's not a good answer. So I guess what I would say is that I'd start off with my experience, and in my experience, and by the way, I don't know if that's the best place to start, but I would start off and say, in my experience, that Jesus really has been faithful when I've tried to, in my life in following him. He has not done everything the way that I wanted him to do. There have been times in my life where I have been severely disappointed and said to him, "So this is what I get? This is what I get for trying to follow you. And when I need you to come through, this is how you treat me." Right? But then in hindsight, after going through the process and being able to look back on it, I could see his hand, at least I think that it's his hand, involved in my life and still providing and guiding and being faithful to what he's promised. And he has not promised me an easy life, a safe life, a comfortable life, a healthy life. He's promised me his presence. He's promised me a good end. Right? He's promised he'll never ultimately leave me or forsake me. He's also promised me that life will be hard and that if I follow him, that I'll be misunderstood and that I'll probably have to sacrifice some good things. And so Jesus, I think, is pretty upfront when he calls us and what he desires from us. I think ultimately the reason why I would say to someone is why they should consider sticking with Jesus, I think it's because deep down we all want the same thing. And that same thing is motivate, like it motivates everything that we do. It motivates why we go to school. It motivates why we get married. It motivates why we eat what we do. And that's because we all want to be happy. Ancient philosophers used to call it the summum bonum, right? The greatest good. And everybody wants that, right? I, you're at university. Why? Probably because you want to get a degree so that you can get a job. You want to get a job so that you can maybe make money, and you want to have money so you can have a house. But at the end of the day, like the last answer that anyone gives to any of those why questions will be, well, I guess because I want to be happy. Like no one ever said, I want to be happy so I can make more money, or I want to be happy so I can go on vacation, or I want to be happy so I can get married. They all say, I want to get married because I want to be happy. I want to have a family because I want to be happy. So happiness is our chief motivator in life. Jesus recognizes this. And he sprinkles lots of his sermons with these kinds of appeals, right? That he provides abundant life, um, that he says, I'm leaving you with my joy. And he talks about, his peace. All of those are in the neighborhood of happiness, but it's not quite happiness because happiness is really just related to the word happening or happenstance, kind of an emotional pleasure in our minds when something good happens. But that comes and goes and comes and goes and comes and goes. What we really want, I think, is deep happiness, deep satisfaction. I think we want to be flourishing people, not just happy people. And people like Socrates and Aristotle and Plato and others argued that a flourishing person is a person who conforms themselves to the nature of reality. They'd say, look, there really is an objective and right way to be human. And the more you bring yourself in line with that, for them it was adding virtue to their character, the more you will be the kind of thing that you were designed or that you're intended to be. And I think that there's really something right to that, right? If you think of a car, a race car going around the track, and when it's firing on all cylinders and it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do, we say, that's what a race car looks like. Or you see a tree that is just loaded with fruit and its leaves are bright and green and it's got a big sturdy trunk. You say, that's what the epitome of that fruit tree is supposed to look like. That's a flourishing tree. Well, if Christianity is true and God has created individual people, or just people, then there is a way that He has designed us to be, a way that He's designed us to function. The more we align ourselves with that, the more of a flourishing kind of person or kind of thing that we are. We're like the tree, or we're like the race car. And unfortunately, though, we seem to think that happiness or is becoming that kind of thing, finding that sense of satisfaction, is going to come from either pleasure or power, um, or maybe financial well-being, and all of those things have a certain amount of pleasure attached to them, happiness attached to them, but they're kind of like lightning strikes against the dark sky. They can light it up for a bit, but they don't stay that long. And ultimately, when you get what you want, you realize it's kind of a low moment in life because it really lets you down and doesn't provide for you the deep satisfaction and joy that you were hoping for. And that's what every world religion has always said. And that's what almost every famous person who's been reflective enough to realize that the fame that they've pursued hasn't given them the joy and the happiness and the satisfaction that they've desired. So if Christianity is true and someone says, well, I just want to just live as I am and have fun, then you would be living out of alignment with A, the world, because God created the world, and B, with your own nature, because you're probably not living in alignment with how God has designed you. Because as the biblical story says, we have this rupture between us and God that has caused us to say, we know better, we're going to pursue our own ends. And you see that really clearly in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve first encounter God after they've sinned. The very first thing they do is they hide. He becomes their greatest insecurity. They think he's got it out for them and that he's not good and that he's going to be harsh on them, and they run and hide. And I think that we sort of have the same deeply held assumption that God's way is not a good way, is that it's laborious and it's heavy and it's no fun, and he's out to cause us to just follow rules and abstain from enjoying things and do all this hard stuff, um, and so we seek our own way, and usually it's not in line with how God's designed us, and it's not in line with how God's designed the world. So I'll pause there. I got a couple more thoughts, but I just wanted to stop so that you guys could jump in.
What are your thoughts, Noelle?
I don't know if I have any thoughts. I'm gonna pass.
One of the things that I was thinking of, John, when you were talking, was about Pascal's wager. I don't know what your thoughts are on that, but this idea of, you're a philosopher, you study all this. If you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about that and what your thoughts are on that. Speaking of, I know you have other thoughts that you were going to share anyway,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, sure, no problem. Pascal was a French philosopher, but he was also a very committed Christian. And his argument was that he thinks that it's better to sorry, I just have a person stepping in the room here. He says that look, if you had to wager, if you're a betting person, then it's better to bet on God's existence, because let's say you bet on God's existence and you follow Jesus. He doesn't actually say Jesus, but this is his assumption, and God turns out to be false, and the whole thing's a sham. Then you don't really lose anything because he's already ruled everything else out as a legitimate option. So he says you just are dead, and that's the end of it. But if Christianity is true and you don't accept it, then it turns out that you lose everything. So it would seem as though the best, the wise person would bet on Christianity now and become a follower. But there are some problems with it that people have pointed out. One is that for Pascal, it was an either or. For many people, it's not an either or. It's, well, Jesus isn't true, but what about Muhammad or Buddha Shiva or Vishnu or any of those other options, right? Like that's one that people have pointed out. Um, and so I mean, I think that there certainly is something to Pascal's wager, though. If you were to be able to say, I don't believe these ones are true, I'm pretty sure I've ruled out those. So it does come down to these last two. And then the other thing is, Pascal's making a wager when he says, if you're at a place where you're not sure and the evidence is balanced, he doesn't think that someone who is a pretty committed atheist who thinks there's no good reason for God should be able to make that wager, because it's almost impossible for someone to say, I'm going to commit to a belief system that I believe is completely false. Like none of us could say we're going to live as though Santa Claus is true, because, well, no matter how hard we try, we just know that he's not. And it's the same thing with Pascal's wager. So if you're a person who says, I'm not sure, and the other options aren't appealing, the only live one is Christianity or atheism, then he says, bet on Christianity because you can't lose.
What about agnosticism? Does he leave room for that?
Well, I think in the end, like agnosticism for him would just be the same thing as just not making a choice, right? It's not making a choice is making a choice in this case. You can just say, I'm not sure which path to go on, so I'm just going to stay here. But on staying on that path is making a choice to stay on that path. And in that case, someone is not actively making a choice to follow Jesus. And therefore that ends up becoming a choice against Jesus, practically speaking.
I was just on a mission trip this past week in LA. And prior to that, I was on some phone call, I think with the Colson Fellows program. They were giving you might be familiar, but they were talking about ideas. And this came up in some of the talks we were giving with the students that we were on, that we were working with. And it was this idea of ideas have consequences and bad ideas have victims. As a Christian, is there a component of that in terms of like when you're talking with people about, hey, get to know if this, like really make a decision about Jesus one way or the other, because there's some consequences here one way or the other. Do you talk about that when you're talking to people about faith?
It depends on who I'm talking to, right? If I'm talking with someone who's really wrestling with it, they generally know that there are consequences. They probably have heard the story, and they might be questioning whether or not they think that the story is true. And maybe it's helpful to remind them that if the story is true, that there are consequences. If Christianity is true, then there are some temporal consequences. You probably miss out on living a flourishing life because you're living out of alignment with the nature of reality and the nature of your own being. And by the way, all Christians are living out of alignment with that to some degree as well, right? None of us really live the way that God would always want us to, by loving our neighbors and loving himself. So I think that's applicable to Christians too. There are consequences for disobedience. There are also significant eternal consequences. It's hard to talk about, but right, the Bible says that as we stand, we're cosmic traitors, that we're morally guilty. And not only that, typically deep down, maybe we really don't want to have a relationship with God because he will kind of, well, maybe ruin our life. I remember talking with a guy once who told me that if God ripped apart the sky and demonstrated his existence, that he would believe in him. And I said, but would you worship him? And he said, no way, because no one has the right to tell me how to live my life. So it's better for him that God doesn't rip open the sky and give him evidence, because that will make him even more responsible for that evidence that he says that he's going to reject. Right. And so then God has to do something with that. And he says, God basically says, if you won't say thy will be done, then I'll say thy will be done. And I will give you what you want, which is eternity apart from me and apart from goodness and apart from all of those things that come with being associated with me. And that's a pretty serious consequence too. So if Christianity is true, you have some temporal consequences, you have some eternal consequences. And I think that those are helpful to bring up.
Mm-hmm. And I know you talked about the truth factor, but what do you say to somebody who says, listen, I can't even go into that Christian realm because I've had people who claim to know Jesus who have really hurt me. How do you respond to that, knowing I mean, I remember, gosh, was it Brennan Manning? There's a lot of great quotes about this, but he was talking about Brennan Manning's old time preacher, wrote some books. Don't agree with all of his stuff theologically, but he wrote something that I thought was really profound about, you know, the problem with people today is people who go around professing, or the biggest cause of atheism in the world today is people going around professing Jesus with their mouths and denying him by their lifestyles. And that's something that an unbelieving world cannot find believable, right? It was something like that. Did you have something, Noelle, or were you just agreeing with that quote?
I just agree with that pretty strongly. I think as I have shared in other episodes. But yeah,
Mm-hmm.
continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
how do you? Oh no, it's okay. It broke up. So I hope that
Yeah.
if I didn't validate what you just said enough,
No,
thank you for
all
sharing.
good. Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I'm sensitive. I'm really sensitive to that. I think that there really is something. I really think there's something there. Jesus says in John chapter 13 that they'll know that you are Christians by your love for one another, that you're my disciples. Francis Schaeffer used to say that the non-Christian world has the right to go to Christians and say, "I don't really think that you're a follower of Jesus." And when a Christian said, "Why not?" they would say, "Because Jesus says that they'll know that I'll be able to tell." Because in John 13, Jesus said that I would know that you're a follower of his by the way you loved one another, and I don't see you loving one another at all. And I think that that can be a pretty indictable offense, and I think that there's evidence for that. That Christians have not treated each other well. Christians have not treated people outside of their Christian world well, and unfortunately, I think what's happening in the United States today, we're seeing this more and more because Christianity was, and I'm using air quotes for this, sort of always been this sort of Christian nation. It's been a pretty good ride for Christian people over the years. Right? There's this historic Judeo-Christian kind of morality, a cultural Christianity. There's a historic Christian connection to the founding of the country. But we are rapidly seeing that change, and I think that it is scary, and I think that Christians can be guilty of overreacting and trying to maintain a certain normativity that they have and wanting to maintain the structures that have always been in place that have been very comfortable, and recognizing that there is maybe a moral shift from the historic, maybe sort of moral paradigm that has been Judeo-Christian-ish for the last few hundred years, and they can become wildly over political, and they can become offensive and angry and concerned more with maintaining the status quo than with the kingdom. So I think that that offends a lot of people. I think probably I see Noelle nodding. Probably finds some of the public perception of Christianity to be repelling and offensive and just all around kind of like jerks. Did you want to say anything, Noelle? I saw you take a pause there.
Yeah, actually. Um I liked I liked how you said like the part about nobody can tell me how to live my life. That was a little bit ago, but I kind of really resonate with that. Um because I haven't really felt like God has reached out and spoken to me personally. I've always felt kind of told that that is what was happening, but not, I've never felt that personally. So just Christians and the people of the church are kind of just, they just ruin it. The whole not practicing what you preach, not loving, not being, the way Jesus would have wanted them to be. Um, and kind of a totally different tangent. But I just had a question of like, have you ever felt unwelcome by the Christian church because of something that you can't change?
No.
Cool. So I have, um, for a few reasons. And that's kind of a lot of my reasoning for not wanting to be associated with it. And I think throughout this podcast experience, it's definitely made me kind of like look into myself and maybe think why I think this way. Um, and a lot of the explanations are, yeah, it's just things that have happened to you in your life. And kind of people have ruined it, like your own assumptions. And I do really agree with all that. I think my reasoning could probably be explained pretty simply on paper, but in my in my real life, when I am alone and when I am actually doing things, I don't feel compelled by God. I don't feel as though God is with me. I don't feel loved by the Christian church. I don't feel compelled to read the Bible. I don't just it's not for me. It feels almost like you guys can have your thing and I'll just be over here. Um and yeah, there's reasoning for that, but I don't know, that doesn't necessarily like make me want to follow it. And I'm just all over the place, but I also the reasoning of like you should just believe in it because like if you do believe in it and it's true, that's everything. But if you don't believe in it and it's true, you lose everything. I agree with that, but I also find that to be a little bit manipulative in the way that, like, why not? Just come on, why not? You know, just come on, just follow us. Like, just do it. Um, it seems a little bit like you're not cool unless you do it with us type thing. And I don't like that. Um, I don't think that I should have to make a decision, especially one as big as this, based on the fact that it would be better for me to believe rather than to not. Because I don't know, and I don't think anyone does.
Yeah, I
Thank you
appreciate
for
that.
sharing.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate that. I tend to think that if Christianity is not true, or if there isn't a God who exists, then all that's really left is pleasure, because there's no design, right? There's nothing that you shouldn't live in a certain way to fulfill a moral code, or you shouldn't live in alignment with a nature that really isn't there, because we're just the product of natural selection, and there's no design that we're intended to be like. We're just the way that we are. I tend to think that if that's the case, then the truth question really isn't all that important, because if you only live once, you might as well live a life that gives you pleasure and gives you enjoyment, because there's nothing really deeper. There's no ultimate satisfaction going to be found in living a way that you ought to live, because there's no ought in that kind of a world. So I hear you when you say, like, the Pascal's wager thing is interesting, but I might lose a lot if I bet on God being there. And what if he's not there? And I curbed all of these desires that I could have had as I lived this life, when I didn't have to curb any of those desires, and I didn't have to live according to the way the Bible says, because it was all wrong. And wow, now I'm here at the end of my life or whatever, and yeah, I sort of feel like I did waste it. So I do think that there is something to the criticism of Pascal's wager of saying, yeah, just believe it, just believe it. Besides that, it's almost impossible to just believe anything that you don't have sufficient reasons for, that you aren't sufficiently convinced of. And it's weird. I think that beliefs have us more than we have them. Unless there is a certain amount of persuasion in our minds, not going to happen. Um, So I hear what you say on all of those things. Um, but if God is true and He really is there, and Christianity is true, then it would seem like it has the if it is that then the consequences are important and they really do matter. And so I really appreciate and encourage you to continue to wrestle with this and think it through and do your best to pull apart all of the naughty thing. Like, I mean, naughty as in like KNOTTY, like, is it my emotions? Is it my experience? Is it reason? Is it my desires? All of those things as you kind of think through this, because yeah, like this is the biggest question that anybody could ever think about, and I'm glad that it's one that you are thinking about and not just being like, who cares?
We have two final questions here, John. There are people who watch or listen to this podcast who are Christians, who want to know how to better love the people in their life who are questioning faith or deconstructing. What encouragement or advice would you give to that person listening right now who doesn't know how to talk with their loved one about their lost faith?
Yeah, well, I would say you're not alone, and there are lots of people who are going through this. When I speak at different events, it's not because of me, but it's because of the topic. They just get packed out with people. I was at an event. There was 900 people at the session I did, and I said, "How many of you know someone or have a family member who's going through this?" And almost everyone in the room put their hand up. So you're not alone. The second thing I would say is don't panic. Uh, a typical move of a parent or someone, a friend who hears from someone they love that maybe they're rethinking their faith, is to try and do everything that they can to make sure that doesn't happen. And you start doing things like, hey, here's a podcast you should watch, or here's a a
Finding
video you
something
should,
real.
yes, you should, right? And they're like, oh, okay, so don't panic. The next thing is, I think you should thank them, because this is a huge, huge issue for many people who are willing to engage in thinking about their faith, because it at one point in their life was their identity, their community. It could have been their job, right? All of those things. For them to come out and say, "Hey, I'm wrestling with this," and they're telling you that, that's something that is maybe it should be really valued, and I think that needs to be acknowledged and say, "Hey, thanks. I assume this is not an easy thing, and that you're willing to bring me into the conversation. Thank you." I think we want to listen really well, and I think we want to listen to truly try and understand, and so that we express love. I think we want to ask only helpful questions, questions such as, "How long have you been feeling this way?" Or "Was there anything that started it? Where are you in the process? Are you at the end of it? Are you in the middle? Are you inviting me into dialogue about this?" Those are helpful questions. Unhelpful questions would be things like, "Are you living in sin? Do you want to sleep with your boyfriend or your girlfriend? Did you ever really believe?" Those are questions that are not really helpful. Maybe most of all, I think we want to express to them that we unconditionally love them, regardless of where they end up on this journey, that we will always care for them, that we will always love them, that we will always accept them, even if they don't believe the same things that we do. Then I think we want to remember things like, if it's someone that that you're in it for the long haul, that you're not playing the short game, that this is a relationship that you want to keep lines of communication open with for a really long time, and maybe let them set the conditions of these conversations. I think it can be legitimate to come back and say, "I know this is about you, but your mother and I, this is something we deeply believe, and so this affects us too. I need some time to process it. Would you be willing to come back at another point in time and engage, so I can ask you some questions, I can get some clarity, and I'll let you set the boundaries. How long, when, where, those kinds of things, and recognize that this is not going to be the basis of a relationship going forward, is me trying to convince you of Christianity's truth." And then finally, just recognize that Judas is not Peter, right? Peter denied Jesus, but he eventually returned to his faith. Peter denied Jesus and never did, and we never know.
Judas.
Yeah, we never know where each person is in this process. And I think it's encouraging to remember that Jesus is more concerned and loves our loved ones more than we do, and so I don't think that he ever gives up on them.
What do you think, Noelle? Is that good advice?
Yeah, all good.
This is the final question. The Finding Something Real podcast is about a journey towards restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love. All things that can be found in relationship with Jesus Christ. Which of those things, real is an acronym, by the way, restoration, eternity, authenticity, and love, stands out to you the most in your life right now, and why?
I think probably authenticity, trying to balance between being authentically who I am and not put on airs and not try and present myself as something that I'm not. And at the same time, also balancing that out with a call that I think Jesus has on my life to live in a way that's not authentically who I am. Right? Authentically who I am is not always good, and there's an authenticity that says don't put on airs and don't make people think that you're better than you are. Be who you are. Don't be super Christian. Don't be ultra pious. And yet, then there's another part that says, and also don't be authentic to who you are in relation with those sinful desires that you have. And I think that's probably.
Good stuff. Well, Noelle and Dr. John Marriott, thank you both so much for being here today. Until next time.